So our guest today is Assistant Professor Chanel Meyers from Whitman College. Chanel, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So in class today, we talked a little bit about your paper on confronting prejudice, but before we get into that, I want to know a little bit more about you as a researcher. So could you, in your own words, describe the research questions that most guide your work?
Yeah. Most of my work focuses on racial diversity. What do we think of as racially diverse, and how being in contexts that are racially diverse impact people's behaviors and attitudes. So this paper that you guys read is a little bit of a tangent from the racial diversity work, though relatedly, I'm interested in racial minorities and their experiences. And so that's kind of what inspired this work, was the main focus of racial minorities and their perceptions and experiences with discrimination online.
Okay, so I asked this question for every single person I've interviewed. So what you just said, it's obvious to me why this work is important, but I also like to give the expert, in their own words, why do you think these topics are so important to study?
Yeah, so I mean, we know that, North America is growing more and more racially diverse. And so what happens when our society does become more racially diverse? And so most of my research questions focus on how everyone reacts or behaves in this kind of more racially diverse context, but also how do the people who we consider racially diverse, how do they experience the world, and how do they navigate interactions with others? And so just given that our society is changing, we do need to start focusing on those research questions that, will be what our society looks like in a few decades, really. So that's why I think it's important.
That's a very apt response. I appreciate that you said North American there. So that's a nice shout out to our
Because
Canadian
I was
audience.
at work, so I'm very...
They just moved from Canada,
Yes.
now back to the United States. So I
Yeah.
appreciate that, moving out of the US-centric look here, but still keeping it within North America. So we'll talk a little bit about your expertise on confronting prejudice. Confronting prejudice seems like it's such an effective means of changing norm perceptions and in turn changing behavior. So before we get into the specifics of your paper, for people who don't study the topic, are there common misconceptions about confronting prejudice that you think people need to know or have corrected?
Yeah, I think, and this was part of what inspired this paper as well, is that what does it mean to confront prejudice, right? What do we consider a confrontation? And a lot of times in the literature, the way people have examined this is that they've looked at people who've confronted versus just not confronted at all. And I think generally, most of society will believe that confrontation is this form or this tool we have to kind of combat prejudice. I think that's a common notion for most people, and that is what the research suggests. But what we define as confrontation or effective confrontation is really up in the air. No one really knows what does that exactly mean. So can I say something like, oh no, I don't think that's what they meant. That's me responding to someone saying something potentially offensive, but is that me confronting in that scenario, right? And I think that is maybe a big misunderstanding, that we don't know what confrontation really means, or we have different ideas of what they mean, and because of that, not everyone's on the same page about what to do in that situation, and like how should I actually confront to be helpful.
I mean, so jumping off of that, if you had ubiquitous control of the entire field, are there certain ingredients that you'd want everyone to agree on what makes something confronting prejudice versus, say, remarking upon prejudice? Or do you think there's something specific that needs to go into a confrontation?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to define exactly what is meant by confrontation, and that's kind of part of the goal of this paper, was to kind of look at those different factors. I mean, if I had complete power over the field, sure, yes, we would have a very clear definition of like what that remark would mean, but a better step in the right direction is to just be really clear about what, factors, valence, what the tone and all those sort of things. What do you mean when you're investigating confrontation to prejudice? Like, is what specifically what type of confrontation? Like,
Okay,
what does someone need to say, right?
so in your paper, you differentiate between passive confrontation and active confrontation. So again, taking this big divide that we had in field between confrontation and no confrontation, drilling down a little bit more into, well, what counts as confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
So I know we reviewed this in class, but it'd be helpful to get your own perspective on it about what specifically differentiates a passive versus an active confrontation.
Yeah, so for the purposes of my paper, we define aggressive confrontation as confrontations that were direct, and really highlighting that, yes, that was a racist thing, and so you had to call it out as racist and be like, that's not okay. And that for the passive confrontations, a lot of times in the literature they have defined it as no confrontation, which gets really confusing because is that really a passive confrontation? And so our idea in this paper was to look at people who did respond but didn't actually, call out the behavior directly. So it was basically, the way we scaled it was just opposite on these factors. So they weren't direct at all, and they didn't call out any of these behaviors. And so a passive response would be like, I'm not sure that that's what they meant, or, that is them responding, but not calling out the bad behavior, and it's not direct in that confrontation.
Do you think that, just looking at these things in the real world, people tend to go through, when they confront, they tend to err more on the side of passive versus aggressive?
Yeah, so like in the bystander literature, there's a lot of talk about this, is that, it's a very risky thing to get involved in a situation and try to, help someone who's in trouble and whatnot. And so often people's tactics in those situations is to be distracting or try to diffuse the situation. And so they'll use these more passive strategies to be like, oh, let's change the subject, or, oh, I'm gonna, talk about something completely different. And that can be effective in those bystander situations, right? But when you're talking about conversations online, what you can also see happen is when people change topics or, say something like, I'm not sure that's what they meant, and trying to diffuse the situation, it often derails the conversation to a completely different direction, which can be good in some instances, but can also be bad in other instances, right? It fails to call out the transgression that has occurred. It changes the topic completely. The perpetrator doesn't suffer any consequences. Everyone's happy. But as humans, who are social creatures, we don't like to cause a ruckus. We want to be polite. There's these norms about how we engage with each other. And so it's easy to see why that kind of response may be more common with people. And so maybe a lot of people are using this strategy when they see something happen that's wrong. But there could be unintended consequences for using this strategy, which you think is actually helping, but because you're failing to actually call out racism as it is, in a sense, you are also helping to perpetuate that behavior in the future.
Yeah, I mean, so to jump off of that point, unintended consequences of a more passive confrontation, I think a very interesting, elegant finding from your paper was that you can give people the same text and just change what the confrontation is below that, whether it's a passive versus an aggressive one. Mm-hmm. So even people are evaluating the text at top, the racist comment, they use that information at the bottom of the screen, the confrontation, to infer how prejudiced, racist this text actually is. So it really speaks to the way that we look towards other people to define norms and set our own standards. And so I found that to be really powerful and insightful. I did have a question about this, of course. It wasn't just praise and praise and praise. Do you have any advice for people who are maybe looking to become better prejudice confronters in the future?
Yeah, I mean, from the findings of this paper, it seems like being very direct and calling out the behavior and, saying something as simple as like, that's racist, that's not okay. Something as simple as that can really signal the norms to everyone that, hey, this is not okay. And then also because you are setting these norms, other people may then also jump on that bandwagon, right? So you can be like the cog of change and in in that discussion to
Snowball
then
down the hill. Yeah.
exactly. And so I know the way we framed the paper was that, you have to be aggressive and confronting, but I mean, even if you looked at some of the examples of this confronting statements, it doesn't always have to be, so like angry and hostile. It can be something simply just directly calling out that behavior and then condemning it, which doesn't necessarily have to be hostile all the time. So I think the best thing you can do is if you see something, a transgression, someone being discriminated against, just saying, hey, this is this behavior and that's not an okay thing to do.
So that sounds like very good advice. Does that advice change at all based on two factors? So one factor, whether it's online versus in person. So I'll start there. Does your advice change at all for when you see that behavior versus online versus in person?
I would say generally, most of the literature that looks on online versus offline, you see very similar like psychological effects or consequences for both scenarios. So I would say, even though I can't speak to it, I don't know what the results would be if we did this in person. um, my advice would probably be very similar for an offline situation as well. I think even more so with online, like it's just so easy to type in a comment and say, hey, that's not okay. And so to me, that would be my advice for everyone. That's the first step you should take if that's something you want to improve on and be a better ally. Definitely, in your social media circles, if you see something that's offensive, you should just type it in. It's easy from your computer. I know it can be scary, but I mean, at least that's a little bit less, face to face and intimidating. So if that can be the first step of your, behaviors, I think that'll benefit everyone.
Right. So I lost my train of thought earlier, and I had a connection to what you were saying about the passive versus aggressive having a different perceptions of how we view the same text. And so this kind of woke me up because oftentimes when I'm seeing these types of things on social media and there's something I disagree with, I think to myself, there goes this person again. Surely everyone else can see that this person is espousing some views that are incorrect here, but that's obvious to everyone, so I don't need to dive in. But what your research really strongly shows is that no, it's the diving in that shows people what's problematic with the original post. So we can't trust people so much just
Right.
to come to this conclusion.
Yeah.
So just to finish up on that thought, so that's another reason why I liked your paper. The other thing that I wanted to see if your advice changes at all for is whether does it your advice change for whether it's someone you know versus someone you don't know. And let's say it's someone you're pretty close with versus someone you really just don't know at all, and it's just someone who happens to cross your feed. Are
Yeah.
there different strategies that you might take for someone that you know? You can be bolder or something like that?
I mean, that will be up to you and your relationship with that person, probably, whether you can be more cavalier or not. I think, you can fine tune how you want that response, and whether it's like, that's not okay, or like, whoa, like, I can't believe you said that. The tone may differ, but I think ultimately you would still want to be very direct, and you can always just take the very, more like conservative approach of just being like, hey, that's offensive, that's not okay. Like it
That
I
seems
think
like it
like
works for
that would be my bare minimum suggestion
everyone.
for regardless of what the context or who you're interacting with. You can still be direct and condemn the behavior in a very, maybe more polite way.
Okay, as we wrap up our time here, I have two last questions for you. Do you have any ongoing research on this topic about confronting prejudice that you're excited about?
Yeah, so It's still very early stages, but definitely like following up on some of this work. You know, there are a lot of different factors we didn't look at. So we didn't look at like a no confrontation versus presence of a confrontation. So to see if these posts just alone, you know, like do our perceptions and our, you know, behaviors, are we going to respond to it? Do they differ if you don't see anybody's responses? Also looking at other groups, we were very targeted in looking at Asian American, their perceptions, and racism targeted to that group. So looking to see if, so one component that was really interesting in the study that we looked at was the presence of a confronter who was either the target group or a majority group member. And so to extend this, we're really interested to see, so what if the confronter was not a target group member, like not the person being targeted, but not majority group member as well. So for example, in these posts, these were racist posts about Asian Americans. What if a confronter who was Latinx or Black responded aggressively? Like what would that do anything? Would that be as effective as a majority group member, because they're also not a target, but they're also you know, racial minority and often stigmatized in similar ways. So what effect would we see when these confronters, you know, we often always only look at the target as the confronter, or, you know, a majority group as a confronter, but what about these other people who may be part of the conversation as well, which very likely mimics what we see right now on social media of, you know, allies. You know, white individuals are not only allies right now, right? We see a wider range of people who are stepping up as allies. So how effective are the confrontations from these allies?
Yeah, I agree. I think greater distinctions across what counts as an outgroup member, different types of outgroup member, will certainly add more nuance and better understanding to these findings. So when you're done with that research, you can come on in a few years and you can tell me all about it. That's a commitment. You can't deny it. Okay, so last question. So when you think about your work in this field and what you hope for, maybe not, you can answer this question both in terms of the confrontation literature in particular, or just broadly on research about racial diversity. What are the questions and issues that you really hope are more fully investigated in the next 10 years, I would say? What do you hope in 10 years from now? What do you really hope that we've made a lot of progress on?
I think we need to investigate all questions on intergroup relations from a minority perspective. That's a huge gap in the literature, and that's part of why I did this research as well, is we know so much about what majority group members think and feel and how they experience these interactions, but we don't know how the minority group feels and how they approach these interactions and what happens, you know, to their perceptions. We really kind of focus mostly on the majority group, and I think that's relevant for all research, all on the confrontation literature, on just racial diversity in general. We're often concerned about how does the majority group feel as a result of these changing things and whatnot, but given that racial minorities are soon going to be a very large proportion of the population, we really should be understanding how they perceive the world. And so that would be my hope for the field, is to start including more of these groups in the research and the theorizing.
Okay, that's very well put. Hopefully you, me, and anyone else who's inspired, who's watching this, can be part of that action. So I really appreciate your time, Chanel, and thank you again.